Hi, everybody.
Evening, sir.
Parimal, you can start, I think.
We can start.
Yeah.
I'll tell the flow of events today because I had a discussion with Dr. Nasli. So it is a kind of seminar presentation by the resident, and Dr. Nasli will intermittently give his inputs and ask questions also as to how you practically manage these patients. So I think we can start, Dr. Gayatri. You can start.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Dr. Nasli, welcome.
Yeah, can you see me?
Wait. I'll go on the view.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
we can see you. Yeah, sure.
You can?
Yeah.
I can't see myself.
There is a video icon at the bottom. Just click
Yeah,
on the video
I press
icon.
that. Yeah.
I've spoken. My name is.
And there would be a bar on the top which shows you all the squares, thumbnails of all
If
the
you tap the top, you will see the thumbnails.
Okay, but you can see me, na?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay.
You are nicely audible also.
Yeah, okay.
So shall we start?
Yes.
Actually, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So the topic for today is approach to stroke and thrombolysis protocols in stroke. So we'll just start by defining stroke. So stroke is stroke is the second leading cause of death worldwide, causing 6.2 million deaths in 2011, and is double the rate of heart disease in China. So stroke may be defined as, or a cerebrovascular accident may be defined as, an abrupt onset of neurological deficit that is attributable to a focal vascular cause. That is, we need to define stroke clinically, with laboratory diagnosis as well as with imaging. Let's discuss some more definitions pertaining to stroke. What is a TIA? What is a transient ischemic attack? So we all know that the brain cannot readily use glycogen. Its only source of energy is glucose. Because of that, even if there is a small obstruction for a short period of time in the brain, and even if it does reverse, we need to call it a transient ischemic. So a transient ischemic attack is basically transient symptoms with complete reversal of symptoms within 24 hours, with or without a neuroimaging evidence. So regardless of the TIA showing itself in the MRI or CT, if the symptoms completely reverse within 24 hours, we have to call it a TIA. And that's
Gayatri,
yes, sir.
can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, I can hear, sir.
Yeah. See, this definition now is needs to be changed. This was the old definition that it should last 24 hours and there should be no neuroimaging evidence. But, this is not true, actually. And a TIA, many of them, especially if they are prolonged, leave DWI lesions on the scan. So actually, if there's a DWI lesion on the scan, it is a stroke because, there is death of brain tissue. So most of the TIAs last for a few minutes, not hours. They last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And therefore, this 24-hour business, I think, is changed now. And though it's written in the old textbooks like that, but I think it has changed. So you need to change this view also.
So then, what time limit should we give a TIA?
So there's no thing of timing. It is a transient attack due to a vascular cause with full reversal, without evidence of infarction in the brain on DWI scan.
Okay.
So there's no time limit now.
Hi, Dr. Kamerkar here. Can I come in?
Yes, of course.
Lean, good to see you again.
Yeah, but I can't see myself,
Okay,
There is a video
my
icon.
question was,
Should I do?
when we talk about TIAs, we should also consider retinal TIAs like hemorrhagic accentuation.
Yes, so visual disturbance also is could be considered. So it could be in the eye or it
Yeah,
could be in the brain.
correct, correct. Because
What is the commonest
many
presentation?
times hemorrhosis physics is forgotten.
Say that again.
Many times hemorrhosis physics is overlooked.
No, others should mute their this thing. There's too much background noise.
Can everybody mute themselves? Only the speaker will unmute and talk. So whoever's
Yeah.
speaking, unmute. Everybody mute themselves, please. Otherwise,
Yes,
nobody
please.
will hear anything.
Yeah, there's too much background
We'll wait,
noise.
we'll wait for a minute. Everybody mute themselves. There is a lot of background noise. Please mute yourself. Whoever wants to speak, please unmute and speak. Okay.
So,
Leslie, go ahead.
Leslie, what I was
Yeah.
saying that many times hemorrhosis physics as a symptom is overlooked and ignored. And I think it's a message we would like to give to all the residents that even that should be looked for in the history when somebody is taking the histories.
Yes, that's very true. Even TIAs are where even if there is a transient hemiparesis or a transient sensory impairment, you will find that many doctors are missing this. And when you ask the patient who has come with a stroke to the casualty, that did you have an attack in the past? They said, yeah, I had many. So I went to my doctor and he said it is due to weakness, or it is because of the temperature, or because the weather has changed, or something stupid like that. So the TIAs, because they are transient and they leave no deficit, they are very often missed by many practitioners. So it's a very big mistake to make. So we must make everyone aware that these transient symptoms, the symptoms are transient, but the disease is severe, because it is a harbinger of stroke within the next few hours or days. So even though the symptoms are transient and fleeting, the implication is very important and very severe.
I think the lesson for all the residents is find out what are the carotid territory and vertebral territory symptoms, and you must be specific to ask them.
Exactly. Yeah, Gayatri. I think, is that
Yeah,
clear
go ahead.
that you need to change this definition a bit? And this
Yes, sir.
definition is old. Perhaps it is written in Harrison. I don't know.
Yes, sir, it is,
I've not read Harrison recently, but
Yes, sir.
definitely it needs to change. This is not the recent most definition.
All right.
Yeah.
Moving on. So hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. So basically, in a hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, the brain doesn't receive oxygen for a very long time, because of which there is infarction in the broader zones between the major cerebral artery distribution, and that causes a global hypoxia ischemia. Strokes do not just have ischemic strokes, there is also hemorrhagic strokes. So the intracranial bleeds are also considered as strokes. Intracranial bleeds they are basically bleed in the neuroparenchyma, which cause a mass effect and which cause a rise in the intracranial pressure. I would also like to talk about stroke in evolution.
Why problem of these diseases continue for a long time? Ischemic injury cannot last few minutes, cannot realize. So they are not in the condition talking of. TIA means the patient has a brief episode from which he recovers. If he is called hypoxic ischemic injury or hemorrhage, that brief is not there. You heard me?
Sir, I wasn't able to hear you.
Did you hear me?
Sir, I
So your
couldn't.
voice was not clear. The voice was not clear.
Okay, I'll try again.
Yeah, now it's better.
You used the thing hypoxic ischemic injury,
Yes, sir.
and you talked about a hemorrhage. Those people do not become right in a few minutes. So they are not there in the question of TIA. TIA requires that the patient becomes well in a short time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour or so. And that's TIA. And anybody who lasts long is not a TIA, so it does not come in the definition of the DD of TIA also.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Okay, carry on.
Okay. Stroke in evolution. Stroke in evolution can be a recurrent or worsening of the symptoms of a stroke, which can occur within weeks to months of the last documented stroke, despite initiation of medications. And that's why, like Sir rightly said, that even if there's a TIA history, we need to admit these patients and observe them so that we can catch if the symptoms worsen or recur. There are just like there are arterial strokes, there are also venous sinus thrombosis, which are venous strokes. So yes. So as I mentioned, there are thrombotic strokes, and there are embolic strokes. Thrombotic strokes, the etiology is usually atherosclerotic, and the embolic is obviously a fatty plaque which breaks away and forms an embolus to cause a block. An example could be obviously a cardioembolic stroke, and then we have the cerebral embolic.
Wait, which are the other types of embolic stroke? So the embolic stroke can be cardioembolic, as you said,
Yes.
or it could be artery to artery embolus. So that's extremely important because you can get a plaque in the aorta, or more commonly you get a plaque at the bifurcation of the carotid artery, and that plaque ruptures for various reasons, and emboli go distally. So embolic stroke can be cardioembolic, which comes from the heart, and artery to artery embolus. And it's extremely important to distinguish the two because the treatment is different.
Nasli, how common do you get cardioembolic stroke without atrial fibrillation?
See, one of the commonest causes is atrial fibrillation, and atrial fibrillation can be because of two factors. It can be non-valvular atrial fibrillation, which you see in older people, or you can get atrial fibrillation secondary to rheumatic valvular disease. Now, or after putting in metallic valves or bioprosthetic valves. So you can get a cardioembolic stroke after a myocardial infarction when there is a LV thrombus. So cardioembolic strokes form about 25% of all strokes, and the treatment of them is different from artery to artery embolus. So therefore, it's extremely important to be able to diagnose this.
Can I come in, Nasli?
Yes.
So this is a very important information for everybody. So when you ask for imaging, that is the key, that one must ask for a good CT angio right from ascending all the way to intracranial, because many times you may miss atherosclerotic plaques in ascending and arch of aorta, which can rupture and embolize. And number two, a good color Doppler of the neck, carotids.
Yes, absolutely important. Whenever you do a CT angio or an MR angio, you should cover the aorta, right from the ascending aorta to the arch of the aorta, including the carotid arteries, going right up into the brain.
Absolutely.
So this is a very, very important point. And for cardioembolic, if you cannot get a good window with transthoracic, you should very freely do a esophageal, transesophageal echocardiogram, TEE.
Yeah.
So use it freely, and it's extremely important to be able to diagnose a cardioembolic stroke. As I told you, the treatments are different. So it's very important.
One point I would like to make here for residents is that many times the forms which you fill for requesting for this test, they are very badly filled, and that is one of the major reasons why a lot of these things get missed out. So like Dr. Nasli said, I think when you're filling up a form, you have to write what all you want that person to see, and then only you'll get a correct answer from that investigation.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, it is done as a routine, and then after that, you are still left
Yes.
nowhere.
One more point.
True.
Sir, do you want to add something? You had started saying something. Hello. Okay.
Dr. Wadia speaking.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
I want to add that you must have a 2D echo of the heart because you want to find a lesion in the heart, maybe an endocarditis, maybe a valve lesion, which will tell you that it is coming from the heart. When you say cardioembolic, means cardiac also has to be checked, not only the vessels.
Yes. So we
Yes.
said that. So you do an echo, and very freely you should do a transesophageal echo. So,
I think most of the time it's in the LA appendages that you need to look for very carefully.
Yes,
Whether there is a
so
flood.
LA appendages at the back. So you may miss it with a transthoracic. So therefore you should do a TEE.
We also have Samir Melankere joined in. Samir, hello. So we welcome you to the group. Okay. Gayatri, continue.
Ichapuri sir, I had a doubt. Sir, when you say non-valvular, when you say valvular atrial fibrillation, patients of stroke who have valvular atrial fibrillation, sir, those valves, can I consider not just those AV valves or mitral valves or tricuspid valves which are replaced? Do I have to also consider if a patient has a ICD, an implant? So, am I making sense?
No, I didn't get your point. See, another thing I forgot to mention is you should do a Holter. Because many times the atrial fibrillation is paroxysmal, and sometimes a 24-hour Holter, or most often a 24-hour Holter, may not pick up the this thing. So you may have to do a 3-day Holter or a 7-day Holter or a 15-day Holter in order to pick. And the longer you do a Holter, the more chance that you will pick up paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. So this is extremely important. So you look for the rhythm, and you also look for any structural change by doing an echocardiogram. So a Holter is extremely important, and every patient, almost every patient, you should not miss that out.
I think you can go ahead with your presentation.
Yeah, Gayatri.
Yes, sir. Let's discuss a little bit about the ischemic cascade. How does the ischemic cascade work? So initially there is a mismatch between the cerebral blood flow and the metabolic demands. That is, there is a vessel which has been obstructed, and the metabolic needs of the brain tissue are not being met. This spontaneously causes a necrosis, an apoptosis, which leads to an electric failure. Of course, since glucose is not readily available right now, the brain tissue starts undergoing anaerobic metabolism, and that produces lactic acidosis, and that causes neuron damage. Furthermore, the electric failure causes something called as the ionic pump failure, which is basically there is a gross depolarization which starts occurring all over the neurons, which cause a lot of sodium retention intraneuronally. That is, there's a lot of calcium influx, which causes a huge inflammatory cascade to begin, which releases a lot of inflammatory mediators. The arachidonic acid chain begins. Free radicals are let out, and all in all, it causes a lot of neuronal damage. Between this, I would also like to talk about the ischemic penumbra, which is the area of the brain which is undergoing ischemia but has not completely infarcted. So it is salvageable with timely thrombolysis. Moving ahead, we all know the symptoms of stroke, quite simple to understand. It is face drooping, arm.
So just before you, because you talked of the ischemic penumbra, just go back.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have an action. Yes.
You know, you should not think of this as a static process, but it's a totally dynamic process. And as time goes on, the ischemic umbra keeps on increasing, and it encroaches and gradually replaces the ischemic penumbra. So in the center of the infarct is the ischemic umbra, where the cells are dead. You can't do anything. They're dead and they're gone forever. But surrounding them, because the cerebral blood flow is reduced, the cells are non-functional but viable. And your role as a physician or a stroke neurologist is to save the ischemic penumbra. And the earlier you save the ischemic penumbra, the better it is for the patient, because the prognosis depends on the infarct size. It depends on the location, of course, but it also depends on the infarct size. So your role as a physician is to limit the size of the ischemic umbra and keep the penumbra viable till the appropriate treatment is given. So this is the most important thing to understand, that it is a dynamic process, and gradually not gradually, even rapidly, the penumbra becomes smaller and smaller and the umbra becomes larger and larger. So you as a physician, your role is to decrease the size of the ischemic umbra.
So this has the implication for your window of thrombolysis and the reason behind doing it.
Exactly. So earlier so this is the reason why time is brain, you know, or tissue. You know, that's where this concept of time is brain has come. The same thing is for the heart. Time is heart, or time is muscle. You know, so that is the importance of time and how quickly you should act, and why it is so important to be very aggressive with early treatment.
Okay, go ahead.
Actually, yeah.
Yes, sir. The stroke symptoms between men and women actually differ a little bit. Despite having the similar symptoms such as face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, even visual problems, it has been seen by the ASA that women also have generalized weakness as one of the symptoms of stroke, disorientation, confusion, as well as memory problems, fatigue, nausea, and vomiting. So it is very easy to understand what a stroke is, how to recognize a stroke. We just have to ask the person to smile, stick out the tongue, have to ask the person to make a sentence. Sometimes the patient might not be able to speak, sometimes the words would be incomprehensible, like the sentence right here. And sometimes we have to ask the patient to also raise both the arms. And if the patient is not able to do even one of these three things, even for some time, it is definitely a stroke. Definitely.
So wait, go back. So you know, this is very important. This is called this is how the acronym FAST has come.
Yes, sir.
Face, what else? Face, arm, and speech. So this is, and T is for time. So this is called the Cincinnati Stroke Scale. Now this was, you know, devised by Pooja Khatri. And it has become a worldwide thing, that this acronym FAST is come because of face, arm, speech, and time. So that is how the acronym has come FAST, and this is how and this is called the Cincinnati Stroke Scale.
Dr. Nasli, in our days when we were undergraduates, there used to be a differentiation between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, and we used to be asked, how do you clinically differentiate? Now, of course, you have imaging, but still, are there any means of differentiating between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke clinically?
Yeah, see, your clinical assessment will be right only in about 50% of 60% of cases. However good a physician you may be, if there is a small hemorrhage, it will look like an infarct. And if it is a large infarct, it will sound and look as a hemorrhage. So, previously we were told that yes, if the BP is very high, or if he suddenly becomes unconscious, or he has sudden severe headache with vomiting, yes, it points more towards intracerebral hemorrhage, and less likely to be an infarct. But you are right only 50% of the time. So though it is important, you have to do imaging. There is just no way you can be right, or anyone in the world can be right 100% of the time. So especially if you're doing thrombolysis, you cannot rely on these clinical parameters, though there are general pointers in that direction. And a good clinician, yes, he could be right 50-60% of the time, but definitely not 100%.
But in this sort of situation, Nasli, when you have a hemorrhagic stroke and maybe a high blood pressure, how important it is to bring the blood pressure? And ask Dr. Makle has also joined us, so I'll ask this to Dr. Makle as well as to you. That this is also for the sake of residents. How should your blood pressure control be affected in these patients, and what should be a cutoff point?
So if it is, so this is important, very, very important point, that how do you bring down should you bring down the blood pressure, or should you not bring down the blood pressure? Now, the answer to this question is in many parts. If it is an intracerebral hemorrhage, the studies have shown, there is a trial called, what is the name? Enchanted trial, I think. That has shown that you bring the blood pressure down to below 150/90 rapidly. And rapidly meaning within the first few minutes, and keep it down for the next few days. Now, if it is an ischemic stroke and you are thrombolizing, then you have to bring it down to below 180/110 and keep it below 180/105 for the next 24 to 48 hours. If you're not thrombolizing, then don't bring down the BP unless it is really high. That means more than 220 systolic, or if there is end organ damage like a myocardial infarction or dissection of the aorta or renal failure or hypertensive encephalopathy. So how do you bring it down? Never, never, never give sublingual nifedipine. This is very commonly given, especially by the casualty people, and they put in nifedipine into the mouth below the tongue, and the blood pressure crashes, and this decreases cerebral blood flow very much, and it does more harm than good. So one of the best treatments which we use commonly is slightly sedate the patient, because they are often agitated, and give labetalol. The labetalol you can give in boluses of 5, 10, 15, 20, and then you can start a labetalol drip to keep the BP down continuously. You can go up to 200 mg labetalol, or even up to 300, though we've rarely done that. Another important thing is look for the cause of hypertension. Sometimes, there's a full bladder and you just put in a catheter and the blood pressure comes down. So, it's also surprising, or if there's pain, the fellow has had a stroke and he's fallen down and fractured his arm or leg, and there's severe pain. This produces severe hypertension, and relieving the pain can also reduce the blood pressure. So look at it holistically, and look at the cause, try to relieve pain, try to relieve a full bladder, sedate the patient slightly, not much, maybe 5 milligrams midazolam or 2 milligrams lorazepam. And then the drug we find most useful is labetalol. It's easily available, it's easy to use. Other drug is IV enalapril, which is also good, but it takes a little time to act. And it works, but you can't control it very well. Labetalol you can control, you can take it up and down, and the other drugs are nicardipine and hydralazine, but they are not easily available to us, so we rely mainly on labetalol.
How often do you use NTG?
NTG now, now you cardiologist chaps now, you all love NTG. but we don't like NTG because it produces cerebral venodilatation and increases cerebral blood, increases intracranial pressure. So we don't really like sodium, not sodium nitrate, nitrate, glycerol, whatever. We don't like it as neurologists, and the cardiologists, of course, like it. And if there is myocardial ischemia, perhaps you can use it. But for the brain, we really don't like this drug. And nitroprusside we rarely use.
Makle, you want to respond?
And don't give sublingual sorbitrate also. Don't give sublingual sorbitrate and don't give sublingual depin. Please, for God's sake. Makle.
Can I chip in?
Yes.
So, going back to the previous slide, and although the incidence is not huge, but especially in India, in young women, when they have a Takayasu's aortoarteritis involving all the major neck vessels, many times you may not get a specific carotidary territory TIA, but the common symptom is just the giddiness or sudden loss of vision. And one has to be wary about these, especially in young women, about Takayasu's involving the carotids and vertebrals.
Yeah, because it involves mainly the subclavian artery, so the vertebral orifices get involved. And Takayasu actually was a Japanese ophthalmologist, and he found patients with optic atrophy, and then he took the pulse, and he found that they were pulseless. So actually, Takayasu is actually a Japanese ophthalmologist. So it can produce ophthalmic symptoms. So ophthalmic symptoms and vertebrobasilar symptoms, especially if the blood pressure drops because of, say, diarrhea or whatever, and you get giddy, you get brainstem signs, and you may even become unconscious, or you can infarct the brainstem.
Correct.
You can't miss out on renal artery stenosis.
They have involvement many times they have involvement of carotids as well. With bilateral carotid narrowing and vertebral narrowing,
yes,
that causes a kind of a global ischemia in the brain.
Yes, of course. So you have to be really astute, and you have to think on your feet and make a diagnosis within the next 5 minutes. So you take the pulse, you take the BP. Actually, you take the BP on both sides. See if there is a difference, because that another thing is dissection of the aorta. Many times they don't come with pain in the chest. So unless you take the pulse on both sides or you see the femoral pulsations, you may miss dissection of the aorta. So that dissection of the aorta can also present as acute stroke.
You cannot clinical examination is the key.
It's rare, but it's very important to make this diagnosis, because if you give thrombolysis to these patients, they will die.
Yeah.
So
clinical examination is the key.
Yes, it is the key. Yeah. Makle, you want to say something?
I think we can go ahead. Gayatri.
Yes,
There's too much background noise.
Somebody, please mute yourself who's not speaking. Please mute yourself.
Gayatri, you can go ahead.
So moving on.
I think Dr. Vaidya sir wants to say something. Vaidya sir, you want to say something, sir? Hello? Sir, do you want to add something? Okay, carry on, Gayatri.
Yes. So moving on. Before thrombolizing the patient, we definitely have to clinically examine, and we have to make sure that it's a stroke. But we have to also make sure that it is something other than a stroke, which has stroke mimics. So there's a mnemonic here, which is behind, which could be easy to understand a few stroke mimics. Some of the stroke mimics could be intracranial masses, intracranial hemorrhages, contusion if the patient has had a head injury. A postictal state could also mimic a stroke, which is, I believe, called Todd's palsy, where postictally the patient has maybe epiparesis for a while, but it completely reverses in 48 hours. A hypo or hyponatremia could also present as an altered sensorium. So metabolic causes should also always be ruled out. A patient of hypo or hyperglycemia could also come in altered sensorium. So that could mimic a stroke. A patient could be intoxicated. A patient with sepsis and infection could also be in altered sensorium. So we have to rule that out as well. Otherwise, other neurological disorders such as migraine, particularly acephalgic hemiparesis, I think, which is a migraine without a headache, but comes with a one-sided weakness, and multiple sclerosis, of course, because the lesions travel in time and space. So the multiple sclerosis could also mimic stroke. Other than that, dissection as well as disc prolapse. Disc prolapse could mimic a monoparesis or a paraparesis. So that could be a stroke mimic.
Can I add into that, Gayatri?
Yes, sir, definitely, sir.
You know, one of the things which is really not pardonable is an acutely ischemic limb with advanced neuromuscular involvement, and which may present like a monoplegia, and many times it is missed out as considering as a central cause, whereas the cause could be local infarction or local ischemia.
Yes, that's true. See, another very important cause. See, every patient who comes to the casualty, you must do the blood sugar. So hypoglycemia is a very important stroke. It produces a focal neurological deficit. I've seen it umpteen times that, you know, the patient comes with hemiparesis or with aphasia. Similarly, hyperglycemia.
Right.
Hyperglycemia also can produce a focal neurological deficit or focal convulsions. So hypoglycemia, and another one is hypoxia. And another very important stroke mimic is functional weakness, functional blindness. You know, the young girl says that suddenly she can't move her hand, or she suddenly can't see with the right eye or left eye. So you should add functional. It's very important. Rarely you see, you know, say brachial plexus lesions or pressure palsies. You know, I was stuck once with one patient. He had a few drinks and then his hand became weak. And, you know, it was very difficult to make out whether it was a stroke or it was just a wrist drop. So, you know, I've been fooled with that. And I've been fooled umpteen times by functional weakness. So you could add this subdural hematoma. What you have said hemorrhage, you should say subdural hematoma. Tumor, you already mentioned mass, so that's important. But subdural hematoma can mimic a stroke in its entirety. So unless you do a scan, you will miss out on this. So this is very, very important. So you could add these things. Instead of saying hemorrhage, you could say subdural hematoma.
My message would be to rule out central ischemic cause or vascular cause as well as peripheral vascular cause, because time is the essence there.
Yes, I think your point is very, very valid, huh, Danesh. Your point is very valid. That, you know, you have an embolus into the femoral artery or into the brachial artery, and that hand becomes weak or leg becomes weak. And unless you see the pulse there, you'll miss it for a stroke.
Because that is the commonest kind of overlapped symptomatology in neuro and vascular.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Gayatri, fine.
Yes, sir,
Good.
yes, sir. There are a few criteria which I would also like to mention, which is the ABCD2 scoring system to evaluate the risk of another stroke after a TI. The clinical characteristics are age more than or equal to 60 years, which gives 1 point. Systolic BP of more than or equal to 140 with the diastolic of more than or equal to 90. Clinical presentations of unilateral weakness or speech impairment with or without weakness, type 2 diabetes, and the duration of TI being more than or equal to 60 minutes or 10 to 59 minutes. So suppose a patient scores about 1 to 6, the patient is at a low to moderate risk. But if a patient gets 6 or more points in this scoring, the patient is at a high risk of developing another stroke after a recent TIA. I would also like to mention another score, which is the CHAD S2 score, which is HA2 ES2 VAF score. So in our previous scoring, we just had heart failure, hypertension, simple age of more than 75, type 2 diabetes, and a history of stroke with TIA. But the new scoring has a heart failure with or without LVEF of less than or equal to 40%, along with a more diverse age of 65 to 74 as well, and a more female prevalence, giving another point. So this scoring also helps us to figure out how much more probable this person is to get a stroke.
I would like to add in this, Gayatri, that majority of the causes of stroke are vascular.
Yes,
and in this, you must add minimum Doppler of carotids, and if required, CT angio of the entire vasculature going all the way intracranially to rule out a vascular cause into this.
Yes. I'm really sorry about this slide, which just got blurred a bit. But I think Chapure sir has already mentioned.
We'll go ahead. We'll go ahead.
All right, this is about the beta blocker that can be used to decrease the BP, which is more than 180 systolic and more than 110 diastolic. Here are some. So we've understood that the patient has got a stroke. We've also ruled out the stroke mimics. Hopefully, the patient has come within the golden hours, which is 4.5 hours. But we also have to make sure that we've seen and ruled out all the contraindications of all the cases, which is the recombinant tissue plasminogen. So here are a few contraindications. A stroke or a head trauma within the last 3 months. Patient who's on an anticoagulation such as warfarin with an INR of more than 1.7, or with a prolonged PTT, or with a PT of more than 15 seconds. Recent MI within the past 3 months, I believe. A prior intracranial hemorrhage also is an absolute contraindication. A low platelet of less than 1 lakh. A high BP of systolic more than 185 and diastolic more than 110. Obviously, this can be replaced, and then the patient can be thrombolized. A patient who has undergone surgery in the past 14 days. A patient who has a TIA or mild symptoms, or we can also say a patient whose NIHS score is less than 3, equal to 3. I'm not really sure about the age, but yeah, age less than 18. Any GI bleed or urinary bleed in the past 21 days as well. As we mentioned previously, hyper or hypoglycemia, that is an elevated sugar of more than 400 or a sugar less than 50, rules it out. And a patient who comes with seizures at the onset of the stroke.
Dr. Nasli, there is a question for you. Now, this issue of primary prevention and aspirin can be controversial. But how often do you find strokes in people who are already taking aspirin?
Oh, it's common, you know. See, aspirin and clopidogrel, they protect up to 20% or maybe 22%, and clopidogrel maybe 1 or 2 percentage points more. But there is no drug which can protect 100%.
And if the person is on these dual antiplatelets, is it a contraindication for your thrombolytic treatment?
No, it is not a contraindication. It is not a contraindication. It is if the patient is on warfarin and the INR is equal to or greater than 1.7, then it is a contraindication.
If the person is on a DOAC for some reason, and he's taken it, say, today evening, just now he's had a stroke, and he's taken the last dose about 24-36 hours back.
Which one? Which
because
drug?
DOACs generally have a short life, half-life.
Yeah. So if he's taken this thing, NOAC, as we call them, newer oral anticoagulant, then you do the APTT. If the APTT is more than 40 seconds, that means the drug is on board. And then if he's on dabigatran, you can, if the APPT is high, you can reverse with idaruxizumab. And after giving idaruxizumab over about 5 to 10 minutes, 5 grams, 2.5 into 2.5, you can thrombolize this patient.
Nasli, one more question. Then the contraindications,
I
you've got hyper.
I agree with that, Nasli.
You have got hyper and hypoglycemia. I mean,
Yes.
common sense is you would do a sugar first. Why would it consider as a contraindication? You would obviously consider correcting the sugar.
Yes. So this point is extremely important. Gayatri, go back to that slide.
Because it is first that you will make sure that your sugars are
Yeah.
okay. So it doesn't become a contraindication. It becomes kind of a necessity
You know,
that you.
this slide is extremely old, and you know what happened was that in 1995, when the NINS trial was done for stroke, you know, the cardiologists were racing ahead, and they were doing thrombolysis, they were doing intervention, and the neurologists were struggling. All the trials for thrombolysis had failed. All of them had failed. So, you know, with streptokinase, they had failed. With pro-urokinase, they had failed. So with alteplase, they had to get a trial which was a success. Otherwise, neurology would have been doomed. So they put in, by hook or by crook, they wanted the trial to be successful. So they put in all these contraindications. And now, 25 years later, most of these contraindications are buried. They're finished. So there are only 2 contraindications. 1, if there is intracerebral hemorrhage, and 2, if there is likelihood of intracerebral hemorrhage. So therefore, say you have a INR which is more than 1.7, or you have a NOAC on board and you don't have a reversal agent. Say you have rivaroxaban, or you have apixaban, for which an antidote is still not available, or you have dabigatran and you can't get the antidote. So these patients are likely to bleed if you give the thing. So these are the 2 main contraindications which are remaining. If the sugar is reduced, so it is a stroke mimic, you increase the sugar by giving IV glucose, and still if the hemiparesis has not improved, you can thrombolize. Similarly, if there is elevated sugar of more than 400, you bring it down rapidly with IV insulin, and then you can thrombolize. If there is a stroke at onset and you are sure that the stroke is secondary to an infarct, which you see on the scan, you can thrombolize. This GI and urinary tract bleeding, surgery in the last 14 days. But you know, if the surgery is in a compressible site, like say piles, or like say a corn, or a tooth extraction, or a cataract, then you cannot give IV. Then you can give IV. So it is a compressible site. So okay, if he bleeds, he'll bleed from there. You can press it. Suppose you've had a bypass, or you've had some major abdominal or urinary surgery, then IV thrombolysis is contraindicated. You would go in directly for mechanical thrombectomy if there is a large vessel occlusion. So you should not allow any patient to go. Elevated blood pressure, you bring it down. Low platelet count is extremely rare, except if the patient is on chemotherapy, or has had dengue in the past, or has liver disease, or has hypersplenism. So it's extremely rare. So you should not wait for the platelet count. You send the platelet count, but you don't wait for the report, because to get the report will take another half an hour, 45 minutes. So send it, and it's extremely rare to get a platelet count in a normal healthy patient, except if he's had dengue or something like that. So MI recent means if it is within the first 6 to 7 weeks, perhaps you would not give it. But a stroke,
Actually, I want to
it's a
ask you
stroke.
about
Huh?
if the person had his last. Ashley,
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
I wanted to ask you about the
Yeah. Yeah, go on.
if the
I can
patient
hear
has
you.
been back more than 24 hours ago, is there any need to do any test to proceed the treatment?
No, you do the APTT That is the, what do you call that? PTTK. You do the PTTK. And if it is more than 40 seconds, that means the NOAC is in the system. If it is, if the PTTK is less than 40 seconds, then it's not there in the system. And if the patients don't tell you properly, they'll say, yes, I took it 24 hours ago, but actually they've taken it 12 hours ago. So, you can get into trouble like that. So you need objective proof. So the objective proof is to do the PTTK. And if you find it high, then reverse it.
For dabigatran, is there any use of doing thrombin time?
No.
We have got Samir Melankere also.
It's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Yes, Samir.
Hello. Hi, sir.
Samir, can you speak? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I agree with the APTT being more than 40 seconds. It would definitely mean that the drug is on board. But the reverse is it's a little crude to say that if it is not prolonged, the drug is still not in the system. But it's a rough, in an emergency situation, there's a good crude way of assessing it.
Yeah.
And TT thrombin time should not be done. Doesn't correlate at all. Yeah.
What is your recommendation, Samir?
Regarding?
So if the patient is on Novak,
Yeah. No, what sir has said is quite appropriate. If you nowadays the antidote is available within hours. You can procure it. If you're on the original drug, on Pradaxa, the company will give it free of cost. If you're on a generic drug, you can still buy it. It's about 1 lakh or so. And if you can reverse it, definitely that should be reversed, and then you anticoagulate, so you're safe. But if you're on Xarelto, etc., then it's just a clinical call. Maybe if the patient if you weigh the pros and cons and then decide whether you want to go ahead with the anticoagulation or not. But
Okay.
I wouldn't. The chance
We have taken a meeting. I'm on the webinar.
Nasli, can I make a concluding statement for residents that we should look for giving thrombolytic therapy rather than finding reasons for not to give it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Exactly. Parimal, you hit it on the head. Don't find reasons not to give. Find reasons to give. So it is a mindset. So, there are some very negative people among neurologists also. There are some crazy types. Yeah, they'll find reason after reason not to give. But, you should find a reason to give because it's effective treatment and you're denying the patient effective treatment. So you are doing the patient harm by trying to find out some vague contraindication or the other. So it is a mindset change, and you change your mindset and see how you can give instead of looking at these contraindications. And these contraindications have all been whittled down now. So there is nothing like a contraindication. It has become class 1 evidence or class 2A evidence or class 2B evidence or class 3 evidence. There's hardly any class 3. So you have to weigh the risks. People said, no, that fellow is 90 years old, so we can't give. Who said? Age is not a contraindication. In fact, older people do better. At one time it was a contraindication. High blood sugar was a contraindication. All these have been whittled down, and it has come to, okay, the risk is higher. So the level of evidence is 2A or 2B. It's not 1. Suppose it's a 45-year-old man without contraindication, it's level 1A. But if it's an older person, the level of evidence is 2A, but it's not a contraindication. So we have to get rid of this phenomenon of contraindication and try to give in as many people as are eligible. And
Can I chip in?
Yes.
So many of these absolute contraindications have turned down to relative contraindications.
Yes.
What the specific thing.
So the word contraindication is removed. It is now level 2A and 2B evidence. So you should not use the word contraindication.
Correct. So every clinician has to use this as the risk and benefit and go ahead with the thrombolysis as per the need of the patient.
Exactly.
But one thing also I would like to add, Nasli, is that our decades together in Jahangir, I hardly remember any patient of yours with thrombolysis who had to be endoscoped because of a GI bleeding.
Oh, it's very rare.
Common to have
it's very rare. GI bleeding is very rare. What we are worried about is intracranial bleed because they die. You know, if he gets, I mean, see, when you do the hundreds of thrombolysis now, you will get the intracerebral hemorrhage at 2 to 3%. There's just no way. You'll have to take it, and you'll have to take it on the chin. You feel miserable at the end of it because, you know, the fellow bled into the brain and died. But you benefited 90% of people or 80% of people. So, you know, you take it on your chin. I used to feel very, you know, my 14th case got intracerebral hemorrhage and died. And I was in misery for a few days after that, and I couldn't sleep. But you have to go on, you know, things happen. I mean, it's not foolproof. By no stretch of imagination is it foolproof, but it is certainly very useful. Yeah, continue.
Similar eligibility criteria for IV thrombolysis. Thrombolysis between 0 to 4.5 hours. Sir, could you please tell us why we cannot thrombolyze below the age of 80?
See, because the trial was not done for below the age, but, you know, suppose the fellow has mitral stenosis and has embolized. So we've done it, you know. We've done it in a 16-year-old, but, you know, in a child, the causes are different. It's usually not thrombosis, you know. It could be sickle cell anemia, or there could be moya disease, or, you know, there could be a metabolic cause like a mitochondrial disorder. So in that, thrombolysis won't bug. But if you have a patient with mitral rheumatic valve disease who gets a stroke and he's 15, you can do it. Of course you can do it. There's no reason why you should not do it.
Okay.
And, you know, this above 80 also now, this is all bunk now, you know. Above 80 you can do. Above 90 you can do. People have done it 100 also.
Sir, also...
Can I chip in?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, yes.
So, you know, we have gone beyond the, you know, the eras of systemic thrombolysis, right? And today, in today's day and age, we are really looking at cardiodirected thrombolysis locally, where the dose is very small as compared to systemic thrombolysis. And it goes
Not yet,
for,
Ganesh. No, not yet. No. But we will come to that. Yeah, now is the era of mechanical thrombectomy, but that is only for large vessel occlusion.
Yes, yeah, but you know,
if it is a small vessel or a branch occlusion, then IVT is the way to go.
Right. Okay.
Sir, also I wanted to ask, sir, in here, the NIHS score, which points out to a malignant MCA infarct, is also excluded.
Yeah, you see, this is still a controversial thing because, you know, if it is a very, very severe stroke, they may not benefit. So this slide is old,
Right.
but you know, what we call aspect score. So we can do it, but, you know, the patients may not do so well. But it's not really a contraindication. And anticoagulation, we have already talked to you.
Yes, sir. Yes. So finally, we reach thrombolizing the patient. Ideally, we need to obtain 2 peripheral IV accesses, definitely avoiding arterial or central line placements. Review again if the patient is eligible for this. I want to use Retiplase, which is, or Alteplase, which is 0.9 mg per kg body weight, dividing that as a 10% bolus and a 90% infusion over 1 hour. Simultaneously monitoring BP and other vitals. No oral anticoagulants for at least 24 hours till we do a CT scan check for any post-thrombolysis bleeds. And if there is any decline in the mental status of the patient within the 24 hours, we must stop the infusion and infuse cryoprecipitate and re-image the brain to find any bleeds. Finally, we come to the guidelines for the early management of patients with acute ischemic stroke. So this is what I was talking about. The class of recommendation. Class 1 being outweighs risk. Class 2A being a moderate benefit outweighing risks. Class 2B being a weak benefit but still benefit more than risk.
Benefit equal to risk. Benefit equal to or greater than risk.
Equal to or greater than risk.
Yes, equal to or greater than risk.
Class 3 having no benefit or moderate benefit equal to risk. And class 3 is strongly harmful, which is risk outweighing benefit. There are more than one trial done. Level B, randomized. A moderate amount of evidence because of one or more trials done. Level B, non-randomized. Level C, with the limited data. And level C, EO, which is the expert opinion, which is based on individual clinical experience. So this paragraph is just highlighting that level CEO is based on clinical experience and it should not be dismissed. So we can move on to some of the important guidelines I would like to highlight, especially in the case of acute ischemic stroke. So sorry, I'll just try to zoom it a little bit. So here, the guidelines asks us that all the patients with suspected acute ischemic stroke should receive an emergency scan the moment they arrive at the hospital before initiating any other therapy to treat the acute ischemic stroke. So this gives a level 1A of evidence, and similarly, the system should be established so that the brain imaging can be done quickly, so that the patient who is candidate for IV fibrinolysis and thrombolysis can move ahead. So that is also class 1 and level B evidence. Similarly, it also tells us that we can do a non-contrast CT to exclude a intracranial bleed, so that we don't mistakenly give IV outplace. And MRI is obviously better, but if it is a bleed, a CT is better. Also following up with the
It's
CT.
not better. It's not better. It's 1B.
So,
It's
so
1B.
The IC. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. So ICH for so MRI for ICH
is effective.
Okay,
But you see, you can do either. You can do a CT scan or a MRI.
Right.
The advantages of CT scan are it is quick. It has hardly any contraindications, and you can do it within the next 5 minutes. MRI, there are a number of contraindications, like say a pacemaker, or he's got some metal in the body,
Right.
or he's had a bypass in the recent past, or a stent put in. So you have to go through that list. It takes 5 minutes.
Yes, sir.
To go through that list. And many of these patients are restless, irritable. You have to sedate them. So it takes time. So, you can do it. I mean, nobody's saying that MRI should not be done. But the thing to do actually is a non-contrast CT scan followed by a CT angio.
That's right.
CT angio is extremely important to do in almost all the cases. Either CT angio or MR angio. And you don't have to wait for the serum creatinine to do the CT angio. You can do it. The brain is more important than trying to save a few nephrons here and there. So you don't, the radiologist will tell you, creatinine leke aao. To get that damn creatinine will take you half an hour. So it is not required and you can do it immediately. Okay, so either you do a
how much is that?
Yeah.
How much is the time it takes for an MRI brain? Because abdomen takes a...
So MRI brain, if you have to do all the sequences, diffusion, MR angio, flare, it takes 20-25 minutes. So, time is brain. You don't have time. and then you sedate the patient. Patient is restless, shouting, screaming. You have to tie him down, give him some sedative. It takes a long time. It's very easy to say do an MRI, but when you do many patients, you will find that your door to needle time is markedly increased if you have done an MRI compared to CT scan. So if you do CT scan, your door to needle times are 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. If you do MRI, your door to needle time is 35 minutes, 40 minutes. And all the time, you waste time, you're damaging the brain. So,
Can I chip in? Can I chip in?
Yeah.
Because MR NGOs tend to overestimate whatever occlusion stenosis.
Correct.
And it takes a longer time.
Yes.
Whereas CT angio, on a good 64 slice machine,
Yes.
will give you the entire information what you're looking at.
Absolutely
right from
correct.
vessel occlusion, vessel stenosis, and including the CT brain.
Absolutely
so I would prefer a go for CT angio rather than MR angio.
Exactly. You put it very well, and you put it very clearly.
Yeah, Makle, go ahead. You wanted to say something.
See, in the same concurrence, most of our CT scans are 128 slices. We can get better
very
images.
fast.
Of course, and very fast.
Very
within
fast.
5 minutes, within 5 minutes,
Yeah.
you can get the image. And very importantly, don't wait. So you just do a plain CT scan, and in the CT scan machine, give the first bolus of the drug. And then after 5 minutes, you can do the CT angio. You just want to rule out a stroke mimic, or you want to rule out an intracerebral hemorrhage. But so the contraindications are closed. So you give the drug in the CT scan department, and then do the CT angio if you want. If you want to do cerebral perfusion studies, do the cerebral perfusion. So don't wait. The thing is, don't waste time.
Okay.
So and get the drug and give it in the CT scan department. Don't wait for the patient to go to the ICU. It will take another 20 minutes. The lift is not working, the Maushi is not there, the mama is not there, then you'll hear 150 excuses why it was delayed. So, and the resident doctors and the consultant have to push the trolley. You can't wait for the mama and Maushi. You have to push the trolley. I've done it umpteen times. And you give the drug in the CT scan department.
Bottom line is the golden hour is the key, and everybody got to respect that golden hour.
Absolutely. The clock is ticking. Sorry. Yeah.
Makle, go ahead. Makle, go ahead.
Another important point which I want to add is about the patients who have got a stents. Whether to do the MRI. Suppose in case if the neurologist wants to do the MRI, the current available intracoronary stents are, most of them are non-ferromagnetic. They are mostly cobalt chromium.
But the older ones, Makle, see, actually, if it is old, it has already epithelialized.
No problem.
No problem.
Once epithelialized in 30 days, there is no need to worry about
Exactly.
it. Or even if the patient has undergone, say, coronary angioplasty, maybe say 15 days back, and you want to do the MRI, your gantry position is on a head. It is not going to hit the cardiac stent. And most of 90% of them are cobalt chromium. So you don't worry. You just go ahead. Okay.
I think good point.
The point is, Makle, and beyond the working hours, many of the times registrars are basically at the helm of the affairs, and they may not know this information. So, they might delay saying that there is a coronary stent and blah, blah, blah. So I think we as a clinicians and residents as a clinicians must be aware that CT angio is better, quicker, than MR, and go ahead with that.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. Absolutely.
My point was, in case if you want to do the MRI in the middle of a night, don't keep on sort of, getting scared as a cardiologist and which stent he has put, because 90% of the time in the middle of a night, cardiologist say, I don't remember which stent has been put, let me check with the lab, and things will get delayed.
Yes.
Here, with a simple statement, in the current scenario, I can show you the IF2 of any stent. It is a non-ferromagnetic and it is MRI.
So Makhle, you please tell your radiology department, write down to the technician this fact, because at night they make your life miserable. And then you have to make phone call after phone call, and again you waste a lot of time. So please send this information down to the radiographer or the MR technician.
There are two things which make it
Spot on,
miserable. One,
Nasli,
like you
spot
said, is the
on.
creatinine, and second
Yeah.
is this stent issue.
Yeah, so the
On
creatinine also
they
is not
always
important.
skip.
Okay,
Agree,
move ahead,
creatinine
Gayatri.
is not important when it is emergency of a
Emergency.
neurovascular stroke.
Correct. So that qualification is there. In a routine patient, yes, you do the creatinine, but in an acute
Disclaimer,
situation, there is no need.
Sure.
Or you have a peripheral embolization for Danish's case. If there's, so you don't wait for the creatinine. You do the CT angio beautifully. You can see the where the occlusion is. So don't wait.
Gayatri, move ahead.
So MRI, like sir said, CT angio is the best to visualize where the occlusions are. MRI was as accurate as NCCT in detecting hyperacute intraparenchymal hemorrhages in patients presenting with stroke within 6 hours of onset when gradient echo sequences were used. But in patients who awake with stroke or have unclear time of onset, more than 4.5 hours from baseline or last normal, MRI is used to identify diffusion positive fluid attenuated inversion recovery, which is FLAIR, negative lesions, which can be useful for selecting people who can benefit from IV autoclave administration within 4.5 hours of the stroke symptom.
Yes.
So
this point is important. Say, many of these strokes are wake up strokes, or we don't know you're sleeping for 8 hours of the day, 1/3 of the time you're sleeping, and 1/3 of the strokes will occur when you're sleeping. Or the person has been found in the home, he's aphasic, he doesn't know what time, and he was alone and he was found. So we don't know the stroke onset time. So when you don't know the stroke onset time, this MRI is extremely useful because it shows a mismatch. What is that mismatch? The diffusion weighted image shows an infarct, but the flare does not show an infarct. So there is what we call diffusion flare mismatch. So if the diffusion occurs early, it occurs within, say, 20 minutes or half an hour or 1 hour, and the flare to occur takes 6 to 8 hours. So if the diffusion shows it, but the flare does not show it, so you know that this stroke has occurred within 2 or 3 hours, and you can give thrombolysis. So this is called the wake-up stroke trial, and for this, MRI is certainly superior to CT scan. So in this special situation, or if it is a brainstem strokes many times, CT scan won't show. Person comes only with vertigo, or he comes with imbalance suddenly, and you're not sure whether it is vestibular neuronitis or it is a stroke. So then your MRI can help you. So for posterior fossa lesions or a Wallenberg syndrome, you will never be able to see it on a CT scan. Almost impossible. So your MRI scores much more over CT scan. So in these special situations, yes, MRI is worth doing. And I have nothing against MRI, and it's a very, very, very useful test, but you have to use it correctly. And if you do so, it's extremely useful.
Moving on, administration of
Don't forget about this. Forget about this. This is too complicated, and you don't need to know this.
Not doing the IV autoclaves because of neuroimaging, that is important. And also in patients with acute ischemic stroke who awake or have unclear time of onset, as we have mentioned above, MRI is used to identify the flare.
Yeah. So this is what I was talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So mechanical thrombectomy patients
unclear time of onset is discussed. You can go ahead, I think.
I think this mechanical thrombectomy we can take in another session because it will make things a little complicated for everyone.
Okay, sir.
So yeah, it's extremely important. It's extremely important, and this is the new dawn. This is the new dawn in stroke treatment of mechanical thrombectomy. It's very, very important. But you know, I think we are flooding everyone with too much data. So let's move on.
Okay. The only diagnostic test which should be done before anything else would be blood glucose, obviously. Baseline echocardiography should be done.
One question: Can you use tenecteplase? Nasti?
Yes, sir.
What is the advantage of tenecteplase over amylase?
Yeah. See, tenecteplase, it has a lot of theoretical advantages. It is more fibrin specific. It attaches to the clot. It has a longer half-life, and it can be given in bolus form. So it has terrific advantages over IV alteplase. However,
But then we use it.
yes, of course we use it. Now, it has been found that in large vessel occlusions, it opens up the vessel in about 22% of cases, whereas alteplase could open it in about 12 to 13%. So it may be having, at least the trials just now say that it is non-inferior to alteplase. Now, the only question was what dose to use, because, you know, the NORTEST trial, which was done in Norway, used 0.4 mg.
Right.
And the EXTEND trial, which was done in Australia, used 0.25 mg per kg. I think we are getting around to the view that 0.25 is the correct dose. So though dose finding studies have not been done properly, but I think 0.25 is good. It has definitely advantages over alteplase. The bleeding risk is the same. The cost is 10,000 rupees cheaper, but that is because we are using the biosimilar. We are not using the original molecule. And the level of evidence now is 2B. In these latest guidelines, the level of evidence for using tenecteplase is 2B. So it can be used. I think we are using it last year. If I remember right, 5,000 patients have used tenecteplase. It was used in 5,000 patients, and alteplase was used in 13,500. So it's catching up in a big way. It's not yet licensed in America and in Europe, but in India it is licensed. It is FDA approved. So you can use it. That only little fear is that, you know, it's a biosimilar. So, you know, head-to-head studies have not been done. So that's the little doubt. But, you know, many of us have used it, and they
That remains for all. The Indian exam is there.
Say that again.
I think it is meaningless.
It is. You know, there is a lot of politics and a lot of money involved with all pharma companies, and you know how they promote and what this thing is. So, you know, you have to go through all this noise that they have created and look at it objectively. And I think it's a good drug. There's no reason not to use it.
Leslie, one very quick question.
Leslie, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You know, so in all these context, what is preferred? Is it a systemic thrombolysis or a catheter-directed thrombolysis locally?
No.
Especially in large vessel occlusion like carotid.
No. Catheter-directed is not approved. If it is a large vessel occlusion like carotid or M1 segment, then mechanical thrombectomy by a stent retriever or an aspiration device is level 1A evidence.
No, I agree with that. So it's basically
but
intervention locally.
Not intra-arterial. Not intra-arterial. Intra-arterial is not approved.
One quick question, Nasli.
Yes,
when you did all these trials,
yeah,
what was the primary endpoint on which all these things were assessed?
The primary endpoint was what we call MRS. MRS is modified ranking scale. So modified ranking scale means 5 is you are dead, and 0 means you have no deficit. So if your MRS at 3 months was between 0 to 2, then it had shown benefit, and the benefit was 39%. 39% benefit. It's not 100%. Please, for God's sake, don't think that it is 100%. There is no drug in the world which is 100%. So it gives, I would say, moderate benefit. The number needed to treat, this Altiplase is a very funny drug. Number needed to treat at 90 minutes is 5. And number needed to treat at 4.5 hours is 14. So it's a very funny drug. It's one of the only drugs which is time dependent. So if you use it early, the number needed to treat is 5. And if you do it at 270 minutes, the number needed to treat is 15 or 14. For mechanical thrombectomy, the number needed to treat is 4. If you take MRS of 2, if you take MRS of 3, the number needed to treat is 2. So every second patient will improve and walk home. So this mechanical thrombectomy has now come up in a very, very big way, especially for large vessel occlusion. So therefore, this CT angio is very important to do and to find out large vessel occlusion. And any patient whose NIHS score is more than 6, you should do. In fact, I do CT angio for every acute stroke patient. Because, if you miss large vessel occlusion, you have done a lot of harm to the patient. So these are the numbers needed to treat. But it is a very time-dependent drug. That is the big problem with it is time-dependent. So therefore, you have to hurry up and you have to get all your systems in place so that you do it very rapidly and quickly.
Makli, you want to add something? You put your hand up.
I would absolutely agree with Nasli on that point.
Makli, you want to say something?
No, I already said about that strength which I had to talk. So that particular, I think.
Same thing, Makle, with the heart, no? That earlier you treat, you'll get better. You do PAMI early, you'll get good results. So it is like how time is brain, time is muscle. Is the same thing.
Not only the door to balloon or door to speaker.
As I can see, your slide number is 22 of 33.
My God.
So I think we should finish up, or maybe take the list tomorrow.
Yeah, I think enough for one day, because we already 1.5 hours.
So I think we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow.